Hi, everyone, and welcome to Lurking for Legends, a live video cast where we talk with people from all walks of the publishing industry. I'm Christy Stratus, author of the Dark Victoriana collection, and my awesome co host is Richard H. Stevens, author of the epic fantasy series The Legends of the Lurker, the Bainbridge companion novels, the Soulforged Saga, and the Highcliff Guardians. Lurking for Legends is a live interactive broadcast, so we encourage viewers to chime in with any questions you may have or to comment on anything you hear in the show. So tonight we're super excited to have sci-fi-fantasy author L.M. Spilsbury. Welcome, Louise. It's so great to have you here.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here and to finally meet you.
Absolutely. So let's just start out with you telling us a little bit about yourself and your writing.
Sure. I spent a career in working in laboratories that tested basically food products for safety. Um, and I started my career in the local university and then moved into the provincial government, and then the whole laboratory was divested back to the university. So I finished out my career at the University of Guelph. And for many years, in the latter part of my career, I supervised a laboratory that tested foods of animal origin for drug residues. Um, I was always interested in writing. I actually had a vision when I was 4 or 5. I woke up one morning and I knew with utter certainty that one day I would have a horse and one day I would write a book. And I remember being so happy that that was going to be my life. And so to finally reach the book writing part at this end of my life is really exciting and very fulfilling. So I did the usual thing of reading a lot of books, writing every chance I could. And in the latter few years, I've taken some workshops to try and learn to write more quickly because it's pretty obvious, especially in the self publishing industry, that if you can't put books out on a fairly regular basis, it's very hard to get noticed. And I think I finally reached the point where I'm confident in my ability to do that. So here I am. I actually published my first book 3 years ago in 2018, and it was written over a period of 5 years while I was still working full time. Mostly it was written between about 10 and 11 o'clock at night before I went to sleep, because that was the only time I had. And at the time, I had to learn, I was never very good at plotting stories. And I wrote that book literally not knowing from one sentence to the next what was going to happen. And when I reached a certain number of words, I thought, my goodness, I've got to start wrapping this up. How am I going to do it? And somehow I managed to pull it together. And I published it to prove to myself that I could do the whole thing from beginning to end. But I wasn't confident in my ability to put out a second book very quickly, so I didn't really promote it. And over the past couple of years, I took some workshops with a writer in Kitchener, Jane Ann McLaughlin. She has written books she has written some young adult science fiction books, and most recently she writes historical novels. But she's an amazing teacher and taught me how to structure a story. And then I read a book which gave me the aha moment on how to plot. And so I broke Survivor, the original book, into two, and recently published Immunity Cage, which is the backstory to that original book, which I ended up pulling because I'm in the process of rewriting it now.
Very cool. So you changed from a pantser to a plotter. Oh no.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
a good thing. That's a good thing.
yeah. I consider myself now sort of a blend of the two.
Mhm.
Um, I find that I have to know now where the story's going, how it ends. And I remember Richard mentioning recently that even though he's a pantser, he always knows what the ending is going to be. And I found that, yes, I did need to know that. Um, and I need to know the skeleton of the story, but kind of the actual writing is fairly organic and more of a pantser approach, so that a lot of the details kind of come out of that place as I'm writing. So I guess I'm a bit of a combination. What do they call them? Plantsters or something? Yeah.
I call them a
So
hybrid, and I think I'm
yeah,
becoming a hybrid now because as I write my stories, like I'm into book 13 now, I get so much lore and different ideas that I'm going to include in other stories. I start putting them into what I call a storyline. And then
right.
just before I write the story, I start organizing those into chapters. So I'm starting to become a mini plotter, although I still don't know where the story is going from A to Z. I know
Yeah,
what A is and I know what Z is. I just have to get there. But yeah, and I'm doing NaNoWriMo right now. I've never done that before, and I'm finding the first few days so I'm starting my next book. Yes, there it is. And what a
yeah,
difference it makes when you actually have a skeleton, like you were saying, to write into. So,
yeah.
I just have to fill the words in between these skeletal points. And Jesus, certainly helped my NaNoWriMo go a lot smoother than I was thinking it was going to.
Yeah, I've never done NaNoWriMo myself, but I have a friend who did it a couple of years ago, and she went into it with an outline as well, and, managed to basically write the first draft of a book she was writing. So I admire your courage. I'm not a very quick writer, and I think that if I tried that, it would end up just intimidating me and freeze me up. So I'll just admire other people who do it.
Yeah, I thought I'd try it this year, and so Christy's in a group that we're in now. At least I've got her as a buddy on my thing. So I think
Nice.
the neat part about that is we can encourage each other to keep moving, even when some days we don't quite feel like writing. So, and
Yeah.
Anita Stewart here is also she's in with us as well.
Oh, and wonderful. Yeah, that's great. So actually, you're doing it kind of in a group where you can support each other
Yeah,
rather
well,
than in total
you can set up
isolation.
through NaNoWriMo. You can look for friends just like you do on Facebook, and
Right.
you can bring in all the people that you know that are doing NaNoWriMo, and they become on your little buddy list, and then you can see how many words they've written. So I can give Christy heck if she hasn't written too many words today.
So you have a daily goal.
Yeah, I think the daily goal is about 1,600 and something. If you wrote every day for 30 days, you get your 50,000. So
Right.
obviously, if you do more, I generally don't write on a weekend. I like to have them at the weekends to myself to do just totally unrelated writing stuff.
Yeah.
So I need to up my goal by probably about 700 words. So I need about 2,500 words is my goal, I think, a day.
Well, that's a lot. I know some people can put it out no trouble, but I find that if I can put out 500 to 1,000 a day
Hmm.
regularly, that I'm doing really well.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. And
Yeah.
like I write full time, and that's all I get out. So I'm a slow writer.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I find that by the time I'm done, the stuff I have is doesn't need a lot of editing.
Hmm.
I may shuffle things around a little bit, but my product is pretty finished by the time I get there, but I think it is because I write quite slowly. How about you, Christy? Are you a slow writer or a quick writer?
I used to be a slow writer. It used to take me quite a while. Even though I think my first couple of books I published faster than most other things, but I found that part of my problem personally, I don't think it's the same for you, Louise, at all. My problem was more like a perfectionist mindset where I was
Yeah.
really struggling with putting down like the right thing or,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
phrasing it well enough. And it was really holding me back because how often
Yeah.
can you put something perfectly the first time? So, I started really working on breaking that. And it took a while, but I did break it. And now I'm able to write a lot faster. However, there may be a full rewrite. But I find it
Yeah.
much easier, to do that rewrite because by the time I get to I'm also a pantser. And by the time I get to the end of that draft, I've just gone on and on and on, and I'm not pausing, not stopping to fix anything because I know it's going to
Right.
change. By the time I get to the end, exactly how the rest needs to go.
Right.
So, when I rewrite it, I really know what I'm doing already. So it's almost like I'm pantsing my way through, not quite an outline, but something similar. And then when if I have to rewrite, which I don't always, but if I have to rewrite, it's like a pleasurable experience. I
Yeah.
enjoy it. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what my process has turned into, and it seems to be a lot better and more efficient for me now.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I recently came to that has helped me to be able to write more confidently and therefore more quickly. Um, there's a bit of a story behind this, so I'll back up a little bit. A few months ago, I was looking at book covers for my new book or thinking about it. And I put out the cover for the original book, Survivor, for some feedback on a couple of the science fiction and fantasy Facebook pages. And I hadn't planned to put it on. I think it was science fiction and fantasy authors because it's a huge site with a lot of professionals, and I felt very intimidated. But somehow I posted it there by accident. I went the next day to find out how my post was being answered, and it wasn't where I thought it was. And I finally found it on that Facebook page, and I had a couple of answers, and one of them was a gentleman who said, the cover is quite amateurish, and if you want me to give you more feedback, message me. So I took him up on it, and I did message him, and it turns out he's a professional illustrator. So I got a lot of very useful tips on cover design. But then it turned out that it's his hobby to critique story construction. And and so he was urging me to read a book by Robert McKee called Story, which was a book written for screenwriters. I would never have read it because I don't do screenwriting. But he said, a story is a story. And this guy talks about the theory of story structure. And I read it, and the one missing piece that I needed, and every writer's different, so it probably won't resonate with you guys, but this was the piece that really clicked for me, was he said, every story is really the discovery or the unfurling of what he calls a value. I might call it a theme. And your climax is going to be the point at which the truth of that theme is revealed, and everything before that has to lead to it. And it means that you have to know really what your story is about thematically. And that just really resonated with me because I could never figure out, what's the story really about? Well, it's about this guy who does this or does that. But when I could frame it in terms of, this story is about freedom, and it's specifically about the freedom to have your own thoughts and what happens when you're robbed of that, and what happens if the if the constraints that are put into place to make you not have your own thoughts are suddenly removed and you can't even live with that anymore. How do you regain yourself? When I was able to think of the story in those terms, suddenly it was really easy. Once I knew what the climax was or what the resolution of that theme was, it was much easier for me to write the story. And I think it's going to help me moving forward with all of my stories. And that's been the thing that's made me suddenly feel confident enough to now actually publish Immunity Cage and promote it so people would see it. Because before, I was almost embarrassed for people to see that first book I wrote, because I thought, oh, I don't know if it's good, and I don't know if I can reproduce that. So
I think you're like most authors where you're very hard on yourself.
Mm.
I've been fortunate enough when we first, I met Louise, well, I met you before that through Brian, but I met you in a coffee shop in Guelph, Ontario, just as I was starting out my writing
yeah,
career full time. And I remember talking to you for quite a while in that coffee shop, and you allowed me to read your second book. You hadn't finished it. So you had quite a few chapters done with Jean. I can never say it.
yes, Jean.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and it was very well written, I thought. And then about a year later, you let me read the first book when you'd published it, and I don't know whether I bought it or whether you sent it to me or whatever, but I was quite absorbed in the story, and I thought it was very well written. So,
Well,
I
thank
think
you.
as authors sometimes we're very hard on ourselves, and we're probably our biggest critics.
Well, I
And
think you're right. The thing I find so interesting is when I read about other writers talking about their writer, they all are just brimming with stories that can't wait to be told. And, they just can't wait to get them down and they can't get them down fast enough. And I think, wow, like I'm not like that at all. I'm not brimming with stories. I'm brimming with feelings. But to actually structure a story around those ideas and these feelings, I'm not a natural storyteller. I love wordsmithing. I love creating sentences and paragraphs and imagery. I love all that. But actually coming up with a story for me is a real conscious effort. So,
and what you say there just resonates with what I was thinking before we come on. You were a beta reader slash uh, unpaid editor for a few of my earlier works, and one of them was the Royal Tournament. And you actually inspired me to write a chapter that I didn't even have in that novella about
oh,
training day, and so we wrote that in there as well, just because of I pretty well wrote it almost verbatim of what you told me, and it was
oh,
awesome. I didn't want to
I don't
change much of
remember.
it, other than I didn't want to be a plagiarist, so I had to change a wee bit. But there was one line later in the story, and you uh, had me switch it around, and I won't read the whole paragraph, but it goes like this: Javin had seen it before, and talking about this flail. As Javin had seen it before, but without the thick redness that dripped off the metal links into the dirt. It was a scorpion flail, and these people were feeding it blood. And that
Yeah.
was your line, and you were just trying to suggest to me how I might make that scene a little bit more poignant. And I didn't change a word from that sentence. It was a scorpion flail, and these people were feeding it blood. And the really cool thing about that is one of my very first reviews on Amazon quoted that line out of the book.
Oh, you're kidding.
And
I don't
I'm not
even
even the one who
remember
wrote it.
that.
So you're the one who penned that line, not me, but it was in my book. So
Well, thank you. I don't remember. I remember the flail. I remember thinking, well, what does the flail look like? And I said, what does the flail look like? I don't remember any of the rest. So that's interesting.
yeah,
So
no,
yeah, no, I really enjoyed being a beta reader for you. I enjoy editing, like I love all that kind of thing. And I was really sorry, the last book where I finally said no, I agonized over it because I enjoy doing that kind of thing. And I just thought, yeah, if I keep doing this, I'm just sidetracking myself from what I have to do. But I was saying to Brian just recently, if I ever stopped writing, I think at this point I could set myself up to help a few people with their editing because it's something I enjoy and I think I'm pretty good at. One of the
no.
things about working in a laboratory, which is so detail oriented, um, everything is done to a standard operating procedure, and if you deviate, things won't work. You have to be able to test the same thing every day and get exactly the same results. So it's very, very painstaking. And also, when I was doing my graduate work, my graduate advisor, most of his graduate students were actually people from other countries who didn't have English as a first language. And so he found my ability to write quite refreshing, but then he was able to go at it even in more detail. And so I learned a lot writing my graduate thesis just about being really clear, exactly clear about what you say and being succinct. Don't use any more words than you have to. So I've been really lucky that in every aspect of my life, fed into this and really helped me to evolve. So, yeah. Well, I'm glad that I was able to help you, Richard, because I remember the flail. I didn't remember the blood.
Yeah, no, and no worries about not reading, being a beta reader as you went forward. That is very time consuming, and I've had people ask me to do that for them, and I'd love to pay it forward, but I'm just so busy with my own stuff that I
Yeah,
almost selfishly have to say no because
yeah,
you only have so much time in a day, and I barely read for pleasure anymore because that's all I do is read all day doing my own stuff. That by the time the day is over, don't feel like reading anymore. It's just, words after word after word, and I've almost lost the
Yeah.
joy of reading myself. But I make up for that in the morning. But no, don't ever worry about not doing it. I appreciate what you did when you did.
Yeah. Well, I was very glad actually to it was just a really nice way to get to know you as well, because we had met over coffee, and I was just so excited to meet a local writer who wrote actually fantasy and not some other genre. So it was really, it was a real mental lift to meet you, and then very flattering to be asked to have helped you with your first couple of works. And I felt very badly that I just had to limit my time, but I know what you mean. You you write and you read your own stuff, and I do read in the evenings before going to bed, but I find that I'm not even reading in my genre anymore. I read other stuff. So I don't know. What about you, Christy? Do you find it hard to read, to have time to read? And
I spend most of my day reading because I am a full-time editor. So I have my own
um,
business, and that's what I do. So all day I read, and before I go to read other things. So
yeah,
it's tough. Finding the time to write is tricky because I have many projects on my plate and everything. So that's one of the nice things about NaNoWriMo, trying to shoehorn that time in there. But I do find that, it used to be that I didn't really want to read before bed because I'd spent literally my whole day
yeah,
reading. And then at some point, I just wanted to read more, but just different stuff,
yeah,
So it's kind of fun. I'll be editing, urban fantasy and a memoir, and I'll be reading like, something that's actually kind of noir from the 1930s, and it's
yeah,
really fun to have just such diverse things to read at one time, and kind of comparing styles and stuff. I'm always analyzing, and I really enjoy
yeah,
that. So, yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I
Mm.
know. There are some writers whose style is so unique, you don't even have to see the name on the book. You can
Yeah.
start reading and know who's writing it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, and that's always kind of a pleasure because it's so
Yeah.
unique. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Exactly.
I wanted
Huh.
to ask you, did you have something, Richard? Sorry. I didn't wanna
No,
interrupt.
no. I was just going to ask you, as an editor, do you find it hard to turn it off when you're reading for pleasure?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Definitely. I mean, it's great when you read a work that's, really well done and you wouldn't change anything. That's awesome. But, it is because, like, as I'm reading, like, the reason I mentioned this 1930s book is because I happen to be reading Dashiell Hammett, and it's, trying to think of which one it is. It just escaped my brain like that. The Glass Key. So, classic old noir type of
Mhm.
stuff, and it is just amazing when you are kind of analyzing that and how, omniscient was, like, the thing back then, and there's actually a
Yes.
surprising
Yes.
amount, like, it's funny because the style back then was definitely to drop a bunch of description, which he does a little bit less of than some other authors, but dropping a bunch of description all in one chunk. And then for things that matter, like emotions, having a lot less of that than you would
Yes.
today. Yeah, and it's very, very interesting comparing that. So, that's fun to analyze. I enjoy.
And I've noticed too in reading, sort of the further back you go, the more words people used, you know?
Yes.
And I guess it's because for a long time before TV and radio, you sat around a lamp at night and would be read to. And
Yeah,
as time goes forward, writing becomes much quicker, shorter sentences, shorter words,
yeah.
um, not as much he said, she said. It's everything just faster paced. And your writing kind of has to keep up with that to some degree.
That's right, and, it's so true what you said. The farther back you go, the longer winded everyone
Yes.
is, and it can be tough, like, even reading the classics, as someone who enjoys classics, it can be tough to get through when you're used to today's style, the modern style of, the short sentences and, like, to the point, and also, all the types of description and emotion that you're used to today is very, very different from what it was back in the day. And, as I write, I don't know if I write in the Victorian era. My books are all
Yes.
Victorian era.
Yeah.
So, I read that kind of stuff too. And of course, it's different when you have a novel. versus serial fiction, which was
Yes.
extended a lot
Yes.
of the time. And when you read it as a full-length novel, you see a lot of the
Yes.
repetition and,
Yes.
catching up and stuff. So yeah, it's great that you mentioned that's so true.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I don't have a history or a background in literature the way you do. My background is in sciences, so any kind of literary work that I've read has been out of my own interest, and there's a lot of it that I haven't read just because I couldn't face reading long-winded stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I appreciate that. I understand.
and yeah, but sometimes I feel like my education's a bit lacking because I don't have the background in reading that stuff, but oh well, we're all different, aren't we?
Oh, yeah, and that's where audiobooks can be super helpful too. It's a
Yes,
little bit easier to read the longer stuff
yes,
and the long-winded
yes.
stuff. But actually, you mentioned, your background, and I did ask you, how much research you've done for your series and how
Mhm.
you go about it. I mean, you have a background in research essentially, and these books certainly play off of your background.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. The genesis of the current books that I'm writing, I had for years I wrote every day. I'd get up at 4 in the morning and I would write for 3 hours before going to work. And then eventually I started doing a master's degree as an adult, and there was no way I could do it all. So I stopped writing it actually because I was doing my graduate work part time while holding down a full time, very demanding job. It took me 8 years to do my graduate work. And about a year after I finished it, I sat down one day not planning to do anything, and suddenly I was writing again. And so it was obviously meant to be. Um, and I was just writing stream of consciousness, and this very interesting character walked on the page who ended up eventually becoming Xian, and I didn't know anything about him. And as it happened at the time, a very good friend of mine is an immunology professor at the University of Guelph. And we were having lunch one day, and she had recently won the Governor General's Award for Innovation in Science. So I was asking her, I thought, maybe I could use immunology as part of this science background. And she sat down and drew me a little diagram about the immune system, which I think I posted in one of my um, Facebook, my author Facebook page posts a few months ago. And that gave me the idea, and I started going from there. Um, as part of the world building, of course, I originally had positioned it a couple of hundred years in the future, and then eventually decided that I can't begin to imagine what Earth will be like in 200 years. So I've changed it to 100 years in the future. And I had to do a lot of research on things like global warming. I read many books on global warming. I had to ask myself, because I hadn't planned this, but I just happened to situate the story in Southern Ontario because that's what I'm familiar with. So one of the pressing questions was, what will the Great Lakes look like in 100 years? Will they be there? Will they have been drained by the southern states who need more water? Will they have evaporated, or will they be filled up because there's so much melt up north? I don't know. And I read a really in-depth book called The Great Lakes Water Wars, which taught me a great deal about the international treaties between Canada and the US on governing the Great Lakes water use. Um, and they actually did pose the question of what will the Great Lakes look like in the future? And the answer was, we don't know. So then I was free to kind of make it up myself. Um, and then, of course, COVID happened. And so, because the notion of my future world was that it would be a world that was riddled by pandemics, which is one of the expected outcomes of global warming, anyways, watching a pandemic unfolding in real time was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And I've done, I would say, hundreds of hours of reading and listening to videos on just COVID. And, I'm not going to get into it because this isn't a session on COVID, but I've been quite shocked by what I've read. And I've discovered that the biggest impacts are really the impacts on society rather than the science. The science, I think, has already pretty clear cut, and there's a lot known about everything from the virus to the vaccines that aren't making it into mainstream media. But the impacts on society have been huge. And so I'm having to take that into consideration as I write my future stories, because it's turned out that some of the ideas that I thought were pretty far out, as far as a security state where everything you do is being watched somewhere, Big Brother, looks like that's not going to be too far off. And so, yeah, it's been very interesting trying to come up with a logical vision of what the future could be like in my corner of the world. Of course, you always imagine whatever it is, and then always something comes out of left field to derail you, so you never really know. But at least I've had to make it reasonable and logical that what I've imagined could happen. So, yeah, it's been interesting. My own background is really, when I was working, my background was really in analytical chemistry, and my graduate degree was in veterinary pharmacology. So I learned a lot of biological sciences to be able to understand science that isn't in my area of specialty, like immunology. But it isn't my area of expertise by any means. And certainly I don't have any background in social sciences. So when it comes to that sort of thing, I'm really winging it. But, I think as long as it hangs together logically, that's what a reader is looking for. And the reader really is more interested in the characters and the story, and the background just is there to enhance the experience and to give it the sense of verisimilitude, I think.
And
So,
it's so true now that you mentioned it, because I recall reading this long before the pandemic. I forget how many chapters you gave me of Immunity Bond. I'm not sure if that's what you called it at the time, but Xian was being, I don't want to spoil the story for people, but at least in
yeah,
that version that I read, he was being farmed or sent off to a distant planet
yeah,
to, he was supposed to be the guinea pig. And
yeah,
and you were talking all about the viruses and everything else that he might encounter, and he's supposed to be engineered or however you called it
yeah,
to survive those things, and they could understand how to deal with these things. And that was years before the pandemic when I read that, so it's quite
yeah.
ironic that this
Yeah,
happened
I
since then.
know. Yeah, I know. I mean, I have my immunology professor friend to thank for some of that idea, because I never spelled it out in the book, but she said, if you had somebody with a special immune system whose immunity cells weren't didn't have self-recognition so that they could be basically transplanted into any body without any kind of rejection reaction, that would be an important thing. So, yeah, I mean, I just call them I said to her, I said, "Well, what if I called them X cells?" And she said, "That would be great. Yeah, that's perfect." So that's what I've called them, so that I didn't have to satisfy all the immunologists in the audience, with exactly which cells are they. So I sort of skirted that whole issue by calling them X cells. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea that we will be facing more pandemics, I think, has been recognized as an offshoot of global warming. And if you read books on global warming, they will mention things like the Zika virus and the various flu outbreaks that we've had, and many others which have never had the global impact of COVID, but nevertheless have been viruses, mostly that have spilled over from animals and that have managed to live in humans, but because they don't do it very well, they tend to make people really sick. So interesting stuff.
You said, that you've probably done hundreds of hours of research, which is really admirable. And, as CJ said, you may have seen the comment, what dedication. It really is. That's a lot. And I know I haven't done hundreds of hours. I don't know how many hours I've done. I've never kept track. But, for the Victorian era, I've done my own research. And I was wondering for you, does it ever I don't know if you write at the same time that you research or if you kind of pause writing and wait until you're done. But if you do kind of pause writing to wait until you're done with your research, do you ever get like impatient or very excited to get back to the writing? Because I know that as much as I love research, I also get impatient, like wanting to write my fiction part.
Yeah. Well, I have to say a lot of the research that I've done on COVID has really, I don't think I'll even be able to incorporate it into the stories because it's going to take me so long to really process it all. And so a lot of the research that I had done, for example, on global warming, that was done beforehand. And while I'm writing, I'm pretty much drawing on what I already know and not what I'm recently learning because, well, especially with something like COVID, where knowledge has been expanding exponentially, and many of the political and medical responses have been evolving organically in real time very quickly. I find that to incorporate that, I think I'd have to write something else later because it's almost too much to take in all at once. But certainly, the basic immunology that I learned and the global warming stuff to create the world, and then even things like architecture and I remember one day, this is a story that is hopefully coming out next year that's not even in this series, it's actually a vampire story, and I had to figure out, how accurate can somebody be throwing a knife? I'm sure if a police officer wanted to look at my search history on Google, they'd be horrified, but just having to go and look up that simple stuff because I don't know anything about weapons. And so constantly looking up details about everything from clothing to weaponry to um, car mechanics, everything. I mean, I guess if you're writing something that is supposed to have some sort of credibility in the real world, you need to know a little bit about a lot of stuff.
Yeah, for
So,
sure. I don't know how authors before the internet actually did any kind of research. Like they would have spent days and weeks and months down at the local library. I'm not sure where else you would have got this stuff other than
yeah. No, I
so
think so. And
it's
I
so
think
close
a lot of
nowadays.
those authors either knew somebody who would help them with their specialty, or they maybe had some education in it,
Mhm.
I don't know, but I agree with you. I suspect perhaps the standard of excellence, the bar was maybe a bit lower as well
Mm.
because people were less sophisticated and less knowledgeable as well. I don't know.
Speaking about sophisticated, I one story I'd like to read from yours, and it's something that you wrote a long time ago, and I was just looking at it on your website, and it was called The Long Way Home. And
Oh, yeah.
it I'm looking at it and going, that looks like the Royal Tournament, except it's done, it looks like in a from a futuristic point of view, where you've got a tournament going on, but I'm reading the Metrodome or the Hippodrome or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I wrote that a long time ago. I mean, that was written back in, I think, the 90s. And, because the writers group that I belonged to at the time, we called ourselves the Ink Blots because we thought we were all crazy. But my fellow writers in the Ink Blots would gently tease me that I couldn't plot my way out of a paper bag. And so I think what I posted on my Facebook page, actually I did it on my website. I posted the 3 installments of the first chapter of that, and then didn't know what to do with it. So it sort of lingered there. But I am incubating a story, I think, to use that because, yeah, it's really good. Like you say, yours is very medieval, Richard, and this one is kind of I think I envisioned a lost colony planet, that was cut off from its source and had to regress and to a certain point, but did still have the technology. I seem to include horses in everything I write, so apologies, but it's one of my addictions and they seem to show up in the oddest places. So yeah.
I don't
I
know if you
really,
happen to watch the Sasser Hill episode. She also has horses in all of her books, so anybody who likes her books should go check out
and sorry,
yours
who's
as
that?
well.
Who's
That
that?
was Sasser Hill, and she writes horse racing mysteries.
Oh,
So, she's said that all of her books have horses in one way or another. So, if anybody here is listening and liked her books as well, you might want to check out
I will
hers.
check her out. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know a fellow addict.
And you have horses in your first book. Immunity Cage is, unless you've taken them out.
No,
I read
no.
the version before you resubmitted it, and it had a horse
Yeah.
farm in there.
Well,
Yeah.
in Immunity Cage, they're there very much in the background,
Yes, but they're
and they're
there.
going to be there a little bit in the sequel, which I'm working on right now, which is really the rewrite of Survivor, which is the one you read, Richard. But again, they don't have a crucial role in the story. They're just more part of the background, but I put them there anyways. I figure if you're really rich in 100 years, you'll have to be really, really rich to have a horse. And since the story takes place among that class of people, it would make sense that they would have horses and money and jewels and everything else they want.
And not trying to do a play on words here, but it certainly makes the background of your story very rich. Like it enhances the background of the story when you have all these different things going on. So you don't just have a blank behind your characters. You've got something else that is going on, which really enriches the story.
Yeah, a few years ago, I read a book on again, it was on writing novels, and it was written of all people by an erotica author. And her book was a really great book on just writing any kind of novel, but because she had such a really good grasp of story structure, I read a couple of her books and was really struck by the fact that she said in her book on writing novels that she never used he said, she said, or any kind of synonym for that. She always tied it together with action. So that was a real challenge for me to try and minimize my use of he said, she said, but it's incredibly difficult to come up with random action that a character is doing while they're talking that fits the scene and fits the moment. You really have to imagine your world really, really well to do that. So, yet again, another tidbit from another author or writer that's really been helpful to bring my writing to life, I think.
Yeah, and I agree. All these little things you hear from all these different authors, I think, help shape what we write. Like I read Stephen King; he said never use an exclamation mark.
Yeah, I
And
remember you
other people
telling
say
me
you
that.
should only have one every 100,000 words. And I think if everybody wrote the same way, I think it would be boring. And
Yeah,
so, I try to limit my he said, she said, and I don't have a lot of, ly words right after the dialogue tag. But
yeah.
every now and then you throw it in there just to, spice up your writing so it's not the same all the time. So instead of having no dialogue tags, period, every now and then it's nice to throw it in there. It's just a bit different read, and I think it spices up the story. But that's just me. So we all
Well,
have our own little styles.
well, and the other thing too is you can't pare it down to the point where the reader is now scratching their head wondering, okay, so who's saying this?
Oh, for sure.
because sometimes you have to have he said or she said, just so that the author or the reader, can keep track of who's talking. Because I find as the author, I know who it is, but sometimes if it's not clear to the reader, that's going to slow them a lot more than throwing in he said, which is often pretty invisible anyways.
Yeah, especially if there's more than two characters in the scene. If there's
Yeah.
two characters in the scene, you can do it fairly easily once you identify the first speaker. But after that, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and as long as it doesn't go on too long,
Yeah.
it's when you read 2 pages of dialogue back and forth that suddenly you start wondering, wait a
You
minute.
start wondering, you got to go back up and look.
Who is this? You have to go back up. Yeah, that's right.
So anyway, Louise, thank you very much for coming on today. I hate to cut you off. I see we're already at 45 minutes, and you're more than welcome to come on again whenever you like. Maybe when you release, was it Modified Immunity Bond? I'm looking at the website here.
Yeah.
So if you want to come back on again next year when you have that book come out, just kind of as a release party, then by all means, send me a message and we'll bring you back in and we'll talk to you some more about your amazing worlds and stuff. I can't wait to read it. And so, yeah, thank you for coming on today, and we wish you the best of luck. So before we leave you, where can we find your books?
Well, right now my books are available on Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Apple, and Barnes and Noble. And I do plan to put out a paperback on Amazon later this month so that it's available for the Christmas market. I know there's one person who has messaged me and said, don't you have a paperback? I read a computer all day long and I don't want to read an electronic document. So that's the plan for that, but that at that point will be just on Amazon, I expect. I don't know much about publishing paper books, so this is all a learning curve for me.
And I'm also in line for a signed paperback too. I need to have one in my library.
Well, thank you. I will make sure you get one. Thank you so much for having me on. It's so nice to meet you, Christy. I've been watching the various episodes, and both of you are so nice. It's made it very comfortable to come on and talk to you about writing.
I'm so glad to hear that. That's wonderful. You've been fabulous.
Thank you.
And Hari Navarro said, wonderful conversation. Learned so much. Thank you. You're most welcome. Thank you for tuning in. We love our readers tuning in. So just before we leave, just a quick update from Christy. Want to know what's going on in the Christy stratosphere?
Yes, I finally published episode 11 of Grimoire Society of Dark Acts. It is the the longest of the episodes for that Kindle Vella historical fantasy series. So if you are currently reading it, episode 11 is up. And if you are a patron, it is up on my Patreon. And if you haven't started reading it, I'm going to pop a link down below. And Richard and I, as we said, are both participating in Nanowrimo. So I'm going to put both of our links down there as well. So you guys can add us if you want to. So far I've been keeping up. That's only one day. So today I still have to do my words. So anyway, that is what's up with me. Go check out Grimoire Society of Dark Acts and read episode 11. I think you guys are going to really love it. I introduce a brand new world. So what about for you, Richard? What are you up to? Or what have you done this past week?
That's awesome. Actually, I just ordered 210 books through my printer in Scarborough. So Louise, if you want to know about a printer, talk to me maybe tomorrow, message me, and I'll let you know about my printer in Scarborough. He's awesome. He's cheap, and he does a good job. So I just ordered 210 books so I can keep selling them at the market. And I'm going to a Christmas market in town here in late November. So I've got those on hand. Dragon Sect is set to release probably November 16th is the soft date. And I'm going to just make it November 16th because I can, I guess. So I'll probably upload it to Amazon on the Sunday or the Monday before November 16th. And then whenever it clicks in, it clicks in. So I always do soft launches now. I don't spend too much time trying to do these fancy book launches. I just, especially with COVID and everything else, I don't bother anymore. So book 2 in the High Cliff Guardian series releases on November 16th, we'll say. And I should be having my audiobook Keeper the Jewel release anytime now. I'm just waiting for Find Away Voices to get back to me and tell me it's live. So, and Nanowrimo, I can't even say that with Nanowrimo. I'm starting Windwalker, which is book 3 in the High Cliff Guardian series. So hopefully I can get 1/3 of the way through that book in the month of November. That would be amazing. So that's what's new with me. And so when we're talking about this a little bit before, when we asked to write what's right about, you often hear the phrase "write what you know," and that resonated with me when we were talking to Louise today about she's got that science background, so she can write that, even though it might not be the science she's writing about. She certainly has a good handle on it. Well, next week's guest is horror author Eddie Generous. Eddie has fallen off 3 different roofs and been lit on fire on multiple occasions. So that should be interesting, finding out what that is all about. So Eddie is the author of several small press books. He has 2.8 rescue cats. Apparently one needed a leg amputation, and is a podcast host living on the Pacific coast of Canada. So this should be a very interesting show. So until next week, for Louise, Christy, and myself, we hope you all have a safe and happy week. Take good care, and thanks for watching.
Bye-bye.